When Johannes Gutenberg introduced movable type to Europe in the 1450s, he not only created a method that could produce writings relatively easily, but he also made the copying of books by hand obsolete, a method that was almost guaranteed to introduce errors into texts. That means for 1400 years or so, the New Testament was highly vulnerable to corruption, both intentional and unintentional. If the New Testament is a document that records the eyewitness testimony of the life and teachings of Jesus, the accurate transmission of these documents over time is a real problem. How could we possibly know that what we now call the New Testament is in fact what was originally written? After all, we don't have the original writings. To deal with the issue of recovering the original text of ancient writings, a discipline called textual criticism was developed. In textual criticism, all the existing copies of a manuscript are compared to each other, and certain techniques are then used to suggest which of the copies are the more primitive ones. For example, when a variation is found in the text, the earlier copies are preferred to the latter ones, since the change was probably introduced sometime after the early copies. Also, the shorter versions of manuscripts are given more weight than longer ones. This is because the scribes who made copies were far more likely to add to the text for clarification or for comment on the passages than to subtract from the text. When faced with variations themselves, the scribes frequently put what they believed to be authentic in the main body of the text and then document the variation in the margins of the page. A third technique is to prefer the reading of the majority of the texts. And a fourth guideline is to prefer the more difficult reading, since the easier reading was likely the result of a scribe trying to fix what he saw as a problem. Each of these techniques is a general rule, not a strict standard. The scribes copied the books in two ways. One way was for each scribe to have the book they wished to copy sitting in front of them. Then they tediously copied word for word the text of the book. The other method required someone to read aloud from the book while several scribes took dictation. This was a much faster way to produce copies, but had an obvious problem. The problem was that certain words sound exactly the same or very similar, but can be written two different ways. This is true of English as well. To and to, or here and here, for instance, are indistinguishable by sound. Because the New Testament canon was not officially recognized until late in the 4th century, the scribes probably treated what they were copying with less reverence than was given to the Old Testament. The New Testament books were treated like other valuable letters and histories until the canon was fully formed. This means the variations we find in the manuscripts were largely introduced into the text before the 5th century. A common misconception about the New Testament is that it was transmitted like links in a chain, each book being copied, which was then copied by someone else, which was then copied by someone else, and so on. This is often likened to the telephone game, where one person whispers a message to another, and then that person whispers it to another, and it goes around the room. By the time it reaches the last person, the message is often corrupt. But this isn't how the New Testament writings were handed down. The books of apostolic origin were considered authoritative very early on, and as a result, the books were highly valued. But each church didn't have each book. So when a church received a document from an apostle, they shared the book by making a number of copies to send to other churches. The recipients also made multiple copies and sent them to other churches, and so on. We even see Paul directing that his letters be shared in Colossians 4:16. As a result, the number of copies grew in an exponential way, with each copy spawning a number of copies. Because textual criticism relies entirely on existing manuscripts, the more manuscripts we have, the more accurately the original text can be recovered. Also, the older the copies we have, the better the standard by which to judge the later ones. In order to understand the confidence we're able to place in the New Testament as being true to the original writings, we're going to look at some other books from ancient history. Plato wrote his Tetralogy in the early to mid-4th century BC. The earliest copy we have is from AD 900, 1300 years later. We know of only 7 manuscripts. Aristotle wrote in the mid to late 4th century BC. The most copies we have of any one work in the original language is 49. The oldest copy is dated AD 1100, 1400 years later. Aside from the New Testament, Homer's Iliad has the greatest manuscript authority of all ancient writings. Homer wrote the Iliad around 900 BC. The oldest copy we have is from 400 BC, a 500-year span. The total number of manuscripts has recently topped 2,200, and the readings agree about 95% of the time. In the case of the New Testament, if we limit ourselves to only the original language manuscripts, we have over 5,600 copies, including fragments. About 100 of these are on papyri, an early form of paper. Papyrus isn't very durable, and so we don't have very many of them. About 300 copies are called uncials and are written using all capital letters on vellum or animal skins. About 3,000 of the copies are called minuscules and are written using cursive or lowercase letters on vellum or paper. The remaining copies come from lectionaries, which were books that collected scripture for reading during worship services. In addition to original language manuscripts of the New Testament, there are a large number of early translations. We have about 8,000 Latin Vulgates, a Latin translation made by Jerome in the 4th century. And we have 9,300 other early versions in languages such as Coptic, Syriac, Armenian, and Nubian. If we include these in the pool of material that can be used to recover the original text of the New Testament, then we have over 24,000 copies to work with, an astonishing amount by the standards of ancient writings. The third piece of the puzzle used in recovering the text is the citations of Scripture and the writings of the early Church Fathers. Their writings quote the New Testament over 36,000 times and include all but 11 verses of the New Testament. Most of these manuscripts were found in monastery libraries around the Mediterranean. Here are a few of the more important finds. The oldest complete New Testament is called Codex Sinaiticus. It was found in a monastery on Mount Sinai in 1859 and contains about half the Old Testament as well. It dates from AD 350, over 40 years before the canon was officially recognized. Codex Vaticanus is dated between 325 and 350 and contains almost the entire New Testament. The oldest fragments were written on papyrus, which was cheap but easily fell apart. We have a little over 100 fragments, half of which date from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The Chester Beatty papyrus dates between 180 and 200. One codex comprises the complete writings of Paul, including Hebrews, and another collects all 4 Gospels and Acts. A third collection of papyri contains Revelations. The Bodmer papyrus is a copy of most of John, from between 150 to 200. Another fragment contains the oldest known fragment of Luke. The oldest universally accepted fragment of the New Testament was found in Egypt in 1920. It's from John's Gospel and is dated between 125 and 130. If John wrote his Gospel shortly before AD 70, then the span between writing and the copy is 60 years or so. If John wrote the book around 80 to 85, then the span is 50 years or less. There are 2 notable copies whose dates are currently being debated. The Magdalene Papyri, also called the Jesus Papyri, is a set of 5 fragments that contains parts of Matthew, originally dated as 3rd or 4th century AD, but have recently been dated prior to AD 70. The other was found as a part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's been dated between 50 BC and AD 50. The text is highly disputed because the content that's preserved on this very small fragment contains mostly common words, but a case has been made for identifying it as a fragment of Mark,